Welcome to the second lecture, and this lecture will be looking at the readings provided in the syllabus related to LGBT persons and their participation and backlash theory. So in the first reading on voting and the LGBT population by Perez, there are a few major findings that they relate from recent studies. And overall, in general, LGBT respondents have been found to be a younger population and also more highly educated. They tend to earn lower incomes and are more likely to fall into poverty. This is especially true for those who are people of color and LGBT. And LGBT individuals vote at about the same rate as heterosexual individuals, but they also are engaged in other forms of political participation at higher rates. So in some ways, they are more politically active. So the research that's provided by Perez points out that throughout the past few elections, there's a certain amount of predictability among LGBT voters, and they overwhelmingly vote for Democratic candidates. However, it is notable that there is close to a quarter of this population, sometimes more, that does not vote for the Democratic candidates. So there's an interesting, sort of theory there about capture hypothesis, that Democrats have sort of done the branding necessary to reach out to this population, and they represent their rights, and that's one thing that keeps them coming back to them. But what explains this other quarter, we're not really sure sometimes. As the literature we've looked at already establishes, the LGBTQ issue is really relevant to all of our presidential elections and even midterm elections, and the 2016 election was no exception to that. So the research shows that Trump received 14% of the LGBT vote, and this has actually caused a lot of scholars to question, again, what is leading to the vote of LGBTQ persons. And there are maybe some really good questions to be asked about that. Now, this is significantly lower than the Republican capture of the LGBT vote in earlier years. But I think it's a really good idea to sort of explain these differences to get the full idea of how minorities in the United States vote. So in the articles that discuss backlash against LGBT policies, there is an important kind of consideration to think about in terms of how a movement might pursue change. And one of the arguments against pursuing change through the courts has been that this might actually lead to more counterproductive backlash, either at the polls because of using the courts in such an activist fashion. It might actually have poor electoral outcomes for whoever supports those cases. And the fear of backlash has been real and has actually been shown to have some evidence behind it. This author is asking that we distinguish very clearly between backlash just as a different phenomenon from the way that normal politics works, which is admittedly a kind of back and forth push and pull situation, especially in our system. Single member districts and winner take all system has led to a two-party system where there is a lot of back and forth in that way. But Eskridge says that there is actually something quite different in backlash politics, and he says that you can sort of identify them based on their motivating factors, how intense they are, and what types of arguments are found within the movements against them. And so the normal type of politics, he says, is simply asking what is the best policy? How do we manage this administratively? How do we cover basic civil rights in kind of this overall constitutional way? And then these other two forms, he says, are really sort of indicative of a backlash type of politics, where you see identity politics engaged, and that's not just the identity of LGBT persons. It engages the identity of whoever might be opposed to that, and brings up all sorts of questions about the identity of heterosexual marriages and the importance of them, and what allowing for LGBT marriage might look like for those heterosexual marriages. And so this becomes a constitutional debate. What is the constitution of our society, in other words, and how do we make the best constitutional outcome for the rights of these people, these different identities, and how are we constituted? That's an important question here too. And then obviously the politics of disgust engages the politics of backlash. And he identifies a lot of the sort of poor attitudes towards LGBT persons, not just related to their morality, but their health habits and their sex acts. So all of these sort of get conjured in some of these backlash politics. Scholars that keep up with the advances and regresses that occur in the movement toward LGBTQ plus equality maintain that some of these judicial steps taken toward marriage equality, especially those prior to Obergefell versus Hodges, which legalized gay marriage in 2015, there were a lot of sort of incremental steps that were taken by state and district courts. And he said that these actually, even though they may have contributed to some rights in some states for gay couples, they actually contributed to local and national backlash. But then other scholars actually reply that that has not been as intense as was anticipated, and that there actually have been some pro-gay consequences, because when this issue gets articulated at the national level, individuals are able to see which argument they fall on the side of. And so it actually has had the consequence of sort of raising awareness about this issue for people. And then another important question is, if the judicial branch is not the proper avenue for pursuing gay marriage rights or non-discrimination, whatever type of policy LGBTQ persons are wanting, it makes sense to question if another institution might work. And some of them do say yes, that if this is done through legislation, most people who have a problem with, from a constitutional standpoint, the judicial branch being overstepping its bounds and being too activist in nature, using the legislature for these types of things might have more of an advantage for the cause in the long run. There is another institution that could also presumably make such a stance, and that would be the executive. And some policies about LGBTQ persons have been passed at the level of the executive, going back to 2011 when Barack Obama removed the don't ask, don't tell policy in the military. But prior to that, Bill Clinton had passed the policy that you couldn't necessarily be kicked out of the military for being gay anymore, but you were not allowed to be open about your sexuality. And so the executive being involved in this type of policy sometimes is also just as controversial, because it does not follow through the sort of normal legislative paths. The article Beyond Backlash comes really in publication date before the previous article that we were talking about, but it does a good job of kind of laying out how backlash occurs and where you maybe can see that in spite of backlash, some advances have also been made. But they begin with really the stepping off point of Hawaii making it legal for gay couples to get married, and that was actually struck down not very long afterwards. But there was kind of a national response to the Hawaii Supreme Court making this judgment. And so you do see that statutory prohibitions on same-sex marriage increased exponentially between 1993, before this case was ever heard of, and in 1998, which is prior to the fall of these statutes that took place because of the Supreme Court case Oberfell. So a lot of responses you see taking place in this chart here that lays out a timeline of sort of anti-gay, anti-same-sex marriage provisions, both at the state and national level. So this article also lays out the electoral victories in addition to some of the setbacks that occur between important state decisions or maybe district decisions related to certain states' same-sex marriage policies. So you see that there is a lot of bad news in this middle column, but then on the right side you do see something of a forward lash, if you will. So again, we see just a continuation of the earlier data and the timeline of setbacks and advances. So this concludes a kind of brief discussion of public opinion and the institutional impacts of LGBTQ plus reforms. I do think that there is a lot more for us to talk about in terms of the current administration, the changes that have been made to the Supreme Court since 2016, with two additional conservative judges that don't have necessarily the most positive record when it comes to LGBTQ rights. So this question of backlash, I think, is definitely an ongoing one. Also, a question of how Congress may choose to treat the issue of the transgender ban in the military, which has recently been issued by the Trump administration, challenged in court, and they have actually won that challenge, meaning that the Trump administration gets to keep the policy of not allowing transgender persons to serve in the military. So in a sense, some of this question of backlash, it may be a real-time question that we need to continue to look at.